Let's cross down to Canberra now and catch up with Labor's Matt Thistlethwaite to get some more on this very issue to start off with. Thanks for joining us, Matt. There's been a lot of calls for this Royal Commission. Labor's been considering its position for some time. Why do you believe a Royal Commission will actually expedite any responses here? Don't we know what the problems are? We just need to get ahead and fix them?
Chris, I attended the Save Our Heroes summit that was put on by the Daily Telegraph in Sydney a few weeks ago, and I met Julianne Finney and other parents of veterans who, unfortunately, their kids had taken their lives in the wake of serving our country. And the one thing that came through for me in those quite harrowing stories was the fact that there's something wrong with the system, that they felt that once their children had left the service of the Australian military, once they presented with problems, that they weren't given the adequate help and resources that they needed to get through and deal with these issues. And we've supported their call for a Royal Commission today because we simply believe it's the right thing to do. Something's not working with the system. Nothing has the probative power in Australia of a Royal Commission, and we really need to use that power to get to the bottom of what's going on and fix this problem.
Gee, we've had a lot of Royal Commissions of late and plenty more underway, and many of them have been drilling into these social issues, but obviously have unearthed some really dramatic problems. I guess this Royal Commission wouldn't be specifically, or at least wouldn't be only, about the suicides, but surely about the treatment of veterans more generally. So many of them encounter various problems, as you say, from post-traumatic stress disorder and all sorts of other problems, just dealing with the system, getting employment, re-embracing civilian life. So it's all those pressure points you would want examined?
Yeah, that's true, Chris. I was fortunate to travel to Afghanistan with the Australian Defence Force in 2012 as part of a delegation viewing the work that they do in combat zones. And I distinctly remember speaking to a surgeon, an Australian Army surgeon that was working at the hospital in Kandahar, and I knew that person because they came from the community that I represent. Now, this was a trauma surgeon, and she told me that she dealt with the most horrific car accidents that you could ever imagine, but nothing prepares you for the situations that they faced in Afghanistan. And when we're putting people in that situation and the toll that that can have on a person's life, you're exactly right. It goes just beyond the issue of suicide. It's the support that we're providing for people whilst they're in the military and beyond. And if something's not working, we need to get to the bottom of it and fix it.
Yeah, we need to be better at it. We essentially put people in situations where they have to put normalcy, normal human conditions and operations aside, and yet they've got to integrate back into a normal human society, and it just cannot be easy. I want to move on to a couple of other issues, Matt Thistlethwaite. Importantly, the government has not ruled out a Royal Commission. They are considering it, and we'll see where that goes. Labor, though, now very much on the record saying they support it. I want to ask about this stoush we're having on the anniversary of the defeat of the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme, the Orwellian name for Kevin Rudd's emissions trading scheme. The Greens saying it's time for Labor to get back to putting a price on carbon. That's really the best way to talk about it, isn't it? I mean, the emissions trading scheme was a price on carbon. Julia Gillard brought in a carbon tax, and that got axed. Is Labor still committed to that, a price on carbon and emissions trading scheme?
Well, Chris, as you know, we're reviewing all of our policies. We took a suite of policies to the last election that didn't involve an emissions trading scheme, and we're reviewing all of our policies at the moment. But I've got to say, it's quite hypocritical of the Greens to be saying this about Labor and our approach to climate change. We all know that a decade ago they had the opportunity to vote for Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme, which was essentially an emissions trading scheme, and they teamed up with the Liberals to knock that off. And Pat Conroy's done some amazing work about the tonnes of emission, the thousands of tonnes of emissions that would have been reduced from our system had we had that system in place for the last decade. So I think it's quite hypocritical of the Greens to try and blame Labor for this when we tried to put in place that scheme and it was knocked off by them and the Liberals.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I think if you're going to do this thing in an efficient way, then an emissions trading scheme is obviously a pretty efficient way to bring in some sort of carbon pricing. And the Greens are hypocritical. Even if they didn't particularly like the scheme and its settings at that time, they could have supported it and push for reforms to tighten it in future years. But the problem here is that Labor dropped it. Labor under Kevin Rudd dropped that policy. They brought it back as a tax under Julia Gillard, and that was knocked over by Tony Abbott. It's a matter of the Greens do have a point, for all their hypocrisy, as you say. They do have a point. If Labor really believes an emissions trading scheme is the way to go, putting a price on carbon, why aren't you out there arguing it? And do you think you could do a deal with the Greens rather than try and do a deal with the coalition?
Well, Chris, we had a similar scheme. It was in place. It was put in place by the Gillard government. And that was working. It was reducing emissions. Electricity prices were much lower than they are today, so households and small businesses and even big businesses were better off than they are today. And of course, we were seeing an improvement in our environment. So we had that scheme in place. Now, we accept that we lost the 2013 election and that the Abbott government removed that. We haven't revisited it. We took another set of policies to the last election. That wasn't successful. As you know, we're reviewing all of our policies, but we remain committed to taking strong action on climate change to reduce emissions, because Australia needs to internationally. And we're seeing calls from Pacific nations at the moment wanting Australia to be stronger on climate change in our region, and that's something that I think that this government needs to be conscious of.
Couple of points on that. It was a tax rather than a floating price, and Julia Gillard said it was a tax. Also, you can't say it improved the environment. There was no time to see any improvement in the environment. Global carbon emissions have increased, continued to increase strongly. But the point you make in defending that policy is important, because you're suggesting, while you can't guarantee it and lock yourselves in, that's where Labor will go. That's where they'll return to, some sort of emissions trading scheme, some sort of a price on carbon.
Well, I'm not suggesting that at all, Chris. I'm saying that we had one in place that was working. It was reducing emissions, and when you're reducing carbon emissions in Australia, you're improving our environment, particularly for our kids. It's really the next generation of Australians.
Well, you're not, because global
emissions
are still increasing. It's only global emissions that matter, and if they're increasing, you're not improving your environment. But I mean, it's a matter of semantics, I suppose. But it's interesting.
Can I just deal with that? I just want to deal with that issue, Chris.
Sure.
Australia at the moment is in a severe drought, and we have water restrictions on for most states. That means that you have to be conscious of the amount of water that you're using. Now, this whole argument that Australia doesn't contribute much to global emissions, therefore we shouldn't be taking strong action, I think is akin to the water savings measures. If someone says, well, you know, the hose that I use in my house doesn't affect generally what's going on globally in terms of water, and therefore I can continue to use water in the manner that I so wish, we're not going to get anywhere, are we? That's why all countries throughout the world have to be involved in reducing emissions.
Yeah, there's a false equivalence though. But the point is not so much that we're a small contributor. The point is that everybody else is going up. Now, if everybody was cutting, reducing emissions, and we were doing our bit, we could see that we would be contributing to a global action that was doing some global good. The point is, we are contributing in reducing our tiny amount of our 1.3% of emissions, while the rest of the world dramatically increases. That's the point. It's not about not doing our bit. It's about recognising the futility of doing our bit while others increase their emissions.
I accept that other nations need to be doing more, and that we need to be looking to those bigger polluters to try and encourage them to reduce their emissions. But it's about the philosophy that you take, the currency that you have and the credibility that you have in those international forums when you talk about these issues. And when you've got Pacific nations saying that they're disappointed in the approach that Australia's taking, when Scott Morrison muscles those Pacific nations into watering down communiques on climate change, you lose all your credibility internationally to make those arguments for countries like China and the United States to be doing more to reduce their emissions. And that's the point that we're trying to make. It's about the philosophy that you take to climate change, and this government hasn't had a strong one on it.
You see, Matt, that's a logical and defendable argument for climate action in Australia. I might not agree with it, but it is a logical and defendable argument. But so often in this debate we have this nonsense trotted out, mainly by the Greens, but too often supported by Labor, that somehow, you know, what we're doing in Australia will stop bushfires or will end droughts and all this sort of nonsense. So what you're saying there is, you know, trying to contribute, trying to be cooperative with the international efforts that if over time they do take some global action, you might actually prevent worsening in the climate. That makes sense. That's logical. We've got to take all this nonsense and emotion out of it, don't we?
Look, I agree. Yeah, we do need to take some of the emotion out of it and try and approach this from a scientific basis. And all of the world's scientists are telling us that time is running out. Now, there's an international forum that's going on at the moment that's looking at these issues, but it is a global approach that's required, and it's about Australia doing its bit. And many people in our nation, I certainly believe that this country's not doing enough at this point in time on climate change. That's the view of Pacific nations, and it's the view of other nations. And I think if we're going to have a strong voice and currency on this issue, then we need to be doing more.